Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. Today is Wednesday, March 4th, 2026. My name is Josiah McGee, and this is a special episode continuing our coverage of the war in Iran. If you missed our episode earlier this week, laying some groundwork, I would encourage you to give that a listen because it provides some helpful context for this conversation and others to follow. It, of course, is a very big story, the war in Iran. We're going to be spending several episodes covering various different angles of it and trying to dive deep into some of these specific issues, because to try to cover everything at once would be simply impossible. Today, we're going to focus on one angle, like I said, that being Iran's proxy network as well. We have with us today a very special guest, Bridget Toomey, who is a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, focusing on Iranian proxies, specifically Iraqi militias and the Houthis. Prior to joining FDD, she was also a Fulbright Fellow in Israel, where she completed an MA in Security and Diplomacy at Tel Aviv University. I'd like to say, first of all, welcome to Bridget. And did I pronounce your name correctly? If not, please tell us if I missed something.
You did, and thank you for having me.
Of course. We're very happy to have you with us today to provide us a little bit more expert insight into the specific angle of what's going on right now. So we're going to go ahead and jump into it because I have a few questions for you. I want to make sure we give you ample time to discuss them. I'll set up the first question for you. In recent years, obviously the case against Iran is focused very heavily on its nuclear program and the ballistic missile program. If you're following the news, a lot of what's coming from the White House, the administration, as far as the justification for the war against Iran, is of course going to continue focusing heavily on those, as did the negotiations preceding this operation. But the Trump administration did make Iran's sponsorship of a proxy network an additional and critical pillar both of the negotiations and its case for the war since it started. So I'd like to ask you just a very high-level question to begin. Why do you think that is?
That's an excellent point that this, another kind of unattended to pillar sometimes. But I think the reason the Trump administration pointed this out is while these other pillars of the Iranian threat have been discussed and their concern for now and for the future, the proxies have been killing Americans for decades. Really, back into the 80s, there were attacks by Iranian proxy groups across the region, outside of the region, that have taken American lives. In particular, thinking of the war in Iraq, we saw the official number is a little over 600 American service members killed by Iran-backed militias. It may be higher than that. And Iran, was behind those IEDs and the weapons that they were deploying against U.S. forces. Fast forward to now, we have the Houthis on the coast of Yemen who threaten commercial shipping. So this has been a threat that is, played out against U.S. forces and against the U.S. presence for decades. So it's not something that can be ignored when you look at all of the components that make up the threat of the Islamic Republic.
Sure. Can you provide us a bit more context maybe for the scope of this problem, I suppose, for those who are not as familiar? Who are some of the major players in this proxy network? Some of the organizations we might need to know about?
Yeah. So two of the ones that have been kind of most in the news, I guess, two arms would be Hezbollah, of course, in southern Lebanon, really. And then you have the Palestinian groups in Gaza, the West Bank. These two, I group them together because Israel has been confronting them for a couple years at this point. They've been depleted, but Iran spent so much time, particularly with Hezbollah in Lebanon, investing resources, training, really building these up. And they still exist. They're still a concern. Those are two that Israel has taken the lead in managing. Then you have in Iraq, you have really a network of proxies there, a variety of militia groups they work together, obviously, and they've come together under what's called the Popular Mobilization Forces. This is an official Iraqi security institution, and so they receive salaries from the Iraqi government. They have access in Iraq, but it's comprised of these militias. The vast majority and the most powerful ones are Iranian proxies. Some will have even openly said, we are loyal to the now deceased, but the supreme leader over the Iraqi government. So there you have this large network. Many militias, those militias have also enabled their leadership and their supporters to infiltrate positions in the Iraqi government, the economy. So in Iraq, it looks not just like a proxy militia landscape, but really a state infiltration activity at a bunch of levels. And then the next big one is the Houthis down in Yemen. They began as a local movement, but then around 2015, the Iranians started to get really involved there. They were involved from the beginning, but they had relationships with the Houthis from the beginning. But in 2014, the Houthis seized a large portion of territory in Yemen and have held it since, most of it. And so the Iranians got very involved when they saw this was kind of a capable force, something that could be used to threaten the Red Sea, a vital shipping route. Particularly when you look at Iran's position, it has the Strait of Hormuz that it can close, and now it has the Houthis that can close the Red Sea, or if they cannot close, they can harass ships as they've attempted to in the past, which is one of the reasons that the Trump administration has put naval forces on the list of targets for Iran. The regime has backed other smaller groups or propped up smaller groups, created smaller groups. I'm thinking of brigades in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but those are kind of the main ones: Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and then the Palestinian groups.
Sure. It stands out to me as you're listing a lot of these groups, a couple of characteristics that to me seem to be common features of these groups. I'd like maybe if you could sort of confirm if this is a correct interpretation. It seems as if most, if not all, of these groups are in some way infiltrating state apparatus, not just operating as a militia, to your point about the Iraqi groups. That also seems to be true of Hezbollah, for example, or the Houthis. The second thing that seems to be a common feature of many of these groups is that they're engaged in some form of sectarian conflict wherever they operate. I suppose Hamas might be an exception to this. They have some claim to being at the forefront of the Palestinian national movement. If you're considering Hezbollah or the Houthis or these Iraqi groups, I mean, they do seem to be sort of pitting Shia Islam against the Sunni Muslim communities that are vying for leadership of those states. Is that true? Do you think that that interpretation is correct? And is that sort of inherent to how these groups operate? Or why do you think that commonality exists between them?
I do think to a large extent the conflict is inherent to how these groups operate because they, and the local communities know this, they are representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are not acting in the best interest of people in these countries, of the citizens. And while you have minorities that will kind of buy into this support for the Islamic Republic or for the supreme leader and clerical establishment, the majority of the citizens, plenty even of Shiites in these countries, don't want their states to become a proxy state for the Islamic Republic, which is what, to your point about state infiltration, what these proxies do aim to do. Not only are they military forces, they aim to co-opt as much of the state power for their own interests and for the interests of the Islamic Republic as possible.
Right. One of the things I think that has been interesting to observe is how much history people are trying to learn quickly about these groups in order to understand the case the administration is making as far as the danger that they pose. And you've laid out a couple examples of specific threats, whether it be to shipping routes, for example, economic stability of the region and its downstream impact on the rest of the world. You've also mentioned, of course, there being casualties to American service members over the last few decades that are caused by these organizations. I think one of the questions that I get frequently, and I'd love to pose this one to you and get your thoughts about, is how big of a threat is it really in the grand scheme of things, especially because so much of the attention recently has been on the ballistic missile program, which is incredibly lethal. I mean, it's caused deaths in several countries around the Middle East just since this war started over the weekend. Obviously, the drone program is also very dangerous. A nuclear weapons program would be probably exponentially more so. And should we be thinking about these groups as posing a serious threat or as more of a nuisance at this point? If you do think they pose a serious threat that should be considered, as credible as the drone and missile programs, what does that look like? I mean, what sort of threats do they pose to the United States and our interests?
I think they are absolutely a credible threat in a variety of different ways. Take the Iraqi militias, but really all of them will never tolerate a U.S. presence in the region. That would always be something that they would be looking to harass, drive out. They would celebrate the killing of any U.S. service members. They would celebrate the killing of U.S. diplomats as well. So they will continue to present a threat to our presence in that aspect. They also have a vested interest in damaging the established economic norms, the business going on, especially with the United States. So maybe we'll get to this later. It's a little surprising to see the Houthis be quiet right now. They have in the past targeted oil infrastructure. The Iraqi militias look like they're doing some of that now. And they would continue to want to disrupt business, both American, Gulf, Israeli, really any of our partners in the region. So they'll continue to be antithetical to U.S. interests. That being said, these militias, the United States needs, I think, to support action against them, but it does not necessarily need to be the only person or leading action against them. What we saw in the campaign against the Houthis, 2015 and on, Yemeni forces, Saudi Arabia, the UAE were kind of the tip of that spear. And many of these proxies can be, I think, if there was a comprehensive strategy to manage them, you would see the U.S. playing more of a support role than necessarily being the force that is driving them out.
Yeah, that makes sense, given the arguably one of the more effective campaigns against the Houthis was Saudi-led. So, of course, there's some history there and some controversy about the crisis that was precipitated by that operation, the humanitarian crisis. But you're right, the United States has played more of a support role in the past in combating those. It's interesting that you brought it up, though, that some of the groups have been very active while others have been a little bit quieter. And I would be curious maybe to follow up on that and see if you can elaborate. I mean, this is pure speculation on my part, but what it seems like is the most active have been the Iraqi militias.
Mm-hmm.
The Houthis have been fairly quiet. Hezbollah is doing something, but is severely degraded. So it's understandable why perhaps they're doing less than you might have seen 2-3 years ago. But why are some of the groups not as active as you might expect? Like the Houthis, for example, is it the fact that Iraq and Iran share a border, perhaps, that there are closer ties between those militias and the current regime? Again, this is just speculation. I'm just curious, what sort of reasoning do you think might explain why the Houthis have been a little bit quiet to this point?
Yeah, I mean, I've been wondering this since I expected them to jump in pretty early on. But I think a couple of factors come into play. I do want to say first, the Houthis have an arsenal still. The U.S. operation against them had successes, but they still have capabilities. So they are making a choice right now, which is surprising given the strength of their rhetoric and their eagerness, particularly during the 12-day war, to jump in support of Iran, launch coordinated attacks. One of the things that I think must be playing into Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the leader of the group's decision-making, is likely their current, I think, struggles economically. They are really strapped for cash. There were late 2025, they were harassing, and early 2026, harassing Saudi Arabia, not with weapons, just verbally, indicating that there could be some escalation in what looked like an attempt to extort them to pay up. Saudi Arabia has frequently chipped in to help Yemen, and the Houthis view them as a way to get funds. But they'll offer it to pay for salaries. They're not trying to necessarily just fund the Houthis, but the Houthis are trying to extort them. So I think the Houthis are looking at their region, the Gulf, and they're not being touched at the moment. So they might be thinking, we have some goals here in terms of funding, stabilizing their control, their territory. Before this campaign started, it looked like they might actually be on the move to expand their territory in Yemen. Things have the news out of Yemen has been quieter, but they were repositioning some forces, looked like they might be going for additional territory. So the prospect of an air campaign against them can't be enticing if they have other goals in the short and medium term. But it's really surprising to see them not jump to the aid of their patron. Now, the Houthis have always exercised a little bit more autonomy from some of the other Iranian proxies, particularly compared to Hezbollah or the Iraqi militias. I think part of that being due to the fact that they were not started by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, in the way that other proxies were. So that may be this independent decision-making coming into play, or semi-independent decision-making. The assessment has been that their independence in decision-making has decreased largely as they relied on Iran for more of their advanced systems, but it's very hard to explain why Iran would want them to sit out now when Iran, is really under an existential threat.
Yeah. Well, I would assume it has something to do with the perceived weakness of the regime. If nothing else, it says a lot about how the proxies view the current strength of the regime and the authority that it can exert on its proxies. That is, I think, pretty noteworthy. If proxies are choosing to sit out at a time when the regime would prefer them not to, then obviously the regime has lost a bit of its leverage.
Yeah. There have been reports, unconfirmed, of course, by Yemeni officials that the regime did ask the Houthis to step in with attacks in the Red Sea. There are also reports that Houthi officials said they would be starting them soon. Those reports came out midday Saturday, and they said they would start on Saturday. So hasn't happened yet. So it's telling that these are, the rumors swirling.
Yeah. No, that's really quite interesting. One other thing I'll share with the listeners, I think, Bridget, your point about the Houthis being a unique proxy and that they were not originally created by the IRGC, but rather sought out sponsorship for the purpose of building up their arsenal. There is also, I think, one other nuanced difference between it and some of the other proxies in that they are from a similar vein or family of Shia Islam, but do share some ideological distinctions with the IRGC that may not necessarily be true of organizations like Hezbollah as well. So there's a lot that we could unpack there, but we don't want to get too bogged down there. But I appreciate you taking some time to elaborate on that a little bit because it is really pretty interesting. I do want to talk a bit about what you expect to happen in the future, though. If one of the primary objectives of this operation is the defeat of this proxy network, the various organizations, what does that actually look like in the context of this current war? And I think what I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is do we have to confront them directly? Because to this point, it seems like outside of response to strikes by the Iraqi militias, for example, almost all the attention has been committed to targets inside Iran. So does the United States need to target these organizations directly as part of the operation in order to defeat this network? Or is the plan and the strategy that if you defeat the regime in Iran, you will, I suppose, as a byproduct, also defeat this proxy network? I mean, how does this work exactly? Now, what do you think needs to happen to actually defeat them?
So I think if the regime is defeated, it will certainly weaken the proxies, but in large part in Iraq and in Yemen, due to their control of the state or state resources, it won't necessarily mean that these proxies just wither on the vine. I think they will require attention to them in particular. In Iraq, it appears the United States and Israel are conducting some limited strikes, some military action there, which I think could have progress in defeating these. And then it would likely take more military action and then sustained pressure on the government in Baghdad. At the moment, they're forming the next government, so that is an opportunity to weigh in and really make sure that it's not Tehran that's deciding that next government in Baghdad. They were playing a large role. They're busy now, so that they will likely be unable to prop up their favorites as they were trying to do. And that will open the door for U.S. partnership, maybe with some more amenable Iraqi leaders to confronting the proxies in Iraq. But it will take a sustained effort to not only handle the militias, which it's very hard to disarm these armed groups, as if there is the will to do it. And then you also have to root them out of the government agencies, the sectors of the economy that they have deeply ingrained themselves in and extort massive resources from. So that's why it would kind of take some sustained attention. And you'd have to do a similar thing in Yemen. That would require a ground operation. Yemeni forces have expressed willingness to do this. They would need support. They would need air support. They would need intelligence support. They would need resources, weapons. All of this can be provided by the United States and by Arab partners. So I think in an ideal world, what I would like to see, is, as this conflict in Iran goes on and afterwards, a strategy really crafted by Washington to roll back this proxy influence. And it's going to have to take into account military factors, economic influence, and how can we leverage our partners in doing this? Because we do not need to be, we don't always need to be the only military power doing so. It does not need to be just a U.S.-Israel operation again. But I think a strategy from Washington, buy-in from Washington, action in some ways. For example, the Houthis get a lot of their weapons by sea, and the U.S. would be kind of the best equipped force, or with our partners to be countering those smuggling routes. There are plenty of things that local forces can be empowered to do that would make a big difference.
I want to be respectful of your time, but I have one final question for you, if that's okay. You mentioned quite a bit in your last answer the need for Arab partners to step up and do more. I think one of the perhaps unintended consequences of this operation thus far is that you're seeing a lot more unification, I suppose, of many of the Arab partners or the Gulf states around the idea that Iran is a very dangerous threat, one that they have been reluctant to challenge directly prior to this operation, but have sort of been forced to because of Iran's actions. Do you think that this war will actually produce more will to counter Iran, and not just the regime, but also its proxies? Is there a chance that maybe we can count on these Arab partners more as a result of what's happened in the last few days?
I think it could. I would certainly hope to see that. Part of the reason that we haven't seen it in the past is this concern about the economic and other consequences, even just encountering the Houthis. Saudi Arabia is extremely concerned about how much of their oil production the Houthis could take offline. And if they feel, that this is no longer a threat that we could wait out or that we could tolerate, this is a time to act against it so that it does not escalate even further. Because from my perspective, it's almost inevitable. If the Houthis are empowered and sitting comfortably in Yemen, at some point they are going to rear their head again in the Red Sea against Gulf countries. And I think at this moment they're really reckoning with the threat that can pose. And I think they're realizing that action might be necessary instead of hoping that over time they reach an agreement and things settle.
Well, thank you for that, and appreciate your thoughtful insights on these questions. I know they're pretty complicated questions, and maybe we don't have all the answers right now because of the fog of war and other things like that. But I do really appreciate your time today, Bridget. Thank you for doing this and for sharing with us. Thank you as well to Lindsay in the background, who's been helping us to produce this episode, and thank you to our listeners as well. We appreciate your time as well. We will continue to monitor this situation and provide you some updates as quickly as we can. Again, diving into some of the underneath the radar issues of this conflict. And we will see you again next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.